Okay, so this is just a little discussion and reflection of this paper, Say No to Genocide, Constructions of Violence and Identity around Gaza. And obviously the example in question is the hellish events that have unfolded from the end of 2023 through to 2024 and 2025. And trying to make sense not of why the events happened or what happened, but to make sense of how they've been interpreted. And that's really critical to understanding this. It's about the way in which acts of violence are interpreted and explained and understood. And it's part of a bigger ongoing area of work of mine, which is about representations of violence, about the competing and contradictory understandings of all kinds of violence, of which this is only one example. And in many ways, this is a sort of a really obvious problem. I mean, the whole reason we have like a criminal justice system with courts and things is because people say different stuff about violence. Like one person says this happened, another person said that happened, and so we need investigators to collect evidence. We need the lawyers to present that in court and argue about the interpretations, to work out who's lying and who's telling the truth, to work out what really happened. But within that model, there's something that I really want to push back against. And perhaps this is the whole point of this paper, is pushing back against the idea that it's simple matter of one person is telling the truth and another person is lying. I think that idea that all we need is more evidence and then we'll work out who's telling the truth and who's lying, and then the mystery will be solved. That is exactly what I want to problematize, and to say it's way more complicated than that. But in what ways is it more complicated than that? And in what is this kind of other space that is neither truth nor lie? And to unpack that problem through this example of the genocide in Gaza. So taking this phrase as a kind of a point of analysis, just the simple phrase, say no to genocide, okay, there's immediately a number of different things that could be meant by that phrase. Firstly, it can mean say no to the very idea of thinking about genocide. Don't keep it out of awareness. Don't doom scroll on social media. Preserve your well-being. Focus on cat videos and Labradors doing cute things, and don't immerse yourself in those particular horrors. So in that sense, saying no to genocide is saying no to an awareness of something, to focus one's awareness on something that is more protective, more self-sustaining, less traumatic. Okay, but of course the other possible meaning is to say no to the claim of genocide, and this is really important. That we can say no, there is no genocide happening in Gaza. Okay, and that's a different no from saying I don't want to know about those horrors. There, it's a specific claim of saying this thing that people are saying is happening is in fact not happening, and that can happen on a number of different levels. It can happen on the contestation of what events are taking place. Saying no, those events are not taking place. That's propaganda, misinformation. In fact, this is what's really taking place. That children aren't starving. What's happening is that certain groups are stealing food for themselves. So the interpretation can be contested, or the very existence of facts. Hospitals are not being bombed. So there, it's the claim that there's genocide that is being said, that is being denied. And of course, that's exactly why, as I pointed out earlier, we have things like courts. That's why we have the International Court of Justice, literally sitting on this case of is the state of Israel committing the crime of genocide in Gaza, and what does the evidence say about that, and what conclusions can we reach? Now, the final and probably the first meaning you thought of is say no to genocide is a kind of a rallying cry of like, no, we cannot allow this to happen. We not on our watch. Okay, so this implies already two different responses to the first two things. Firstly, it says, well, we're going to retain our awareness. We're not going to look away. We're going to look and we're going to ask, is genocide happening? And secondly, when we look at the evidence, we're going to conclude that genocide is happening. And thirdly, that we're going to conclude that that is illegitimate, because genocide is always intrinsically illegitimate, and that it calls for human response. It calls for us to react in some way and to say, never again, in some particular way. So these three ideas, well, let's not be aware of that. I don't believe your interpretation of it, and yes, it is happening, but we need to stop it. We cannot allow this kind of barbarism, inhumanity, cruelty, violence, and criminality to continue. So this range of interpretations is what I want to talk about. And the context is really interesting, because what's interesting about this genocide, and this is, speaking as someone who studied genocide literally for decades, that the question of specifically the genocide in Gaza is in some senses a completely new historical event, simply because this is the first live stream genocide in human history. This is the first time that millions of people every day could see exactly what was taking place, could see the Instagram reels, the TikToks, could see the work of citizen journalists documenting what was happening in their homes and in their streets. So we have this new technological possibility of awareness. And that's one of the things that leads to the first question is, well, do we want that awareness? Do we want this burden of traumatic exposure to the hellscape that we can see unfolding? And what's interesting is this new technology had already been deployed in cases of mass violence. In some sense, a big turning point goes right back to the 1970s, the Vietnam War, and the US's invasion and bombing of Vietnam. That was the first time a war had been shown on television, that people, this before streaming, that people were watching television stations in real time, and the news reports were showing them the horrors. And it produced a huge public reaction that fundamentally changed the interpretation of US imperialist violence. But much more recently, we saw in Christchurch in New Zealand, we saw this mass killer, Australian white supremacist, go into two places of worship and murder 51 people and injure many others. But what is interesting is that he live streamed it, that he released a manifesto and statements saying that he was going to do it and explaining why he was going to do it. And then he literally, from when he left home, going to the mosques that he was targeting, he live streamed a video of himself driving there, of himself shooting these many people, killing 51 of them. And this was a kind of a turning point in the representation of violence. And many authorities actually suppressed that. They banned the online videos, took down the links. But of course, some people were opposed to that. The Elon Musks of the world regard that as an undue infringement of liberties. But what's interesting when you look at that case of the Christchurch killer is he wanted people to see what he'd done. But, and this is what's relevant for us, he wanted people to interpret it in a particular way. Now, most of us interpreting that are just shocked by the horror, the sheer brutal criminality of it. Certainly the courts immediately saw the criminality of this, convicted him on all counts of murder. So that was one interpretation, but that wasn't the interpretation he was hoping for. In his manifesto, he explains that what he believes he's doing is defending his people. And this is really interesting, because here's the genocide overlap, literally defending themselves against a kind of genocide. Not the kind of genocide we see in the Holocaust or in Palestine, but the notion of white genocide, the notion that migration from the global south to white Western countries is going to overwhelm Western culture. It's going to lead to the decline of white so-called civilization, and that he was a hero pushing back against the erasure of his people through multiculturalism and migration. And some people still stand by that interpretation. We still see, massive anti-migrant movements, resurgence of white racism, going from marches on the streets of Australian cities through to the entire Trump administration and his billionaire backers like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. So the issue there is this radical new visibility, but linked to this radical new visibility is even more pressing issue of interpretation. Are people interpreting the Christchurch murders through this white supremacist, white genocide conspiracy theory, or as barbaric, psychopathic, racist criminality? Similarly, the question of Gaza, how is this being interpreted? Now, of course, in the case of Gaza, we see the opposite of the Christchurch killers live streaming. We see a massive attempt to shut down information, the banning of all international journalists from the area, these widespread attacks on journalists, researchers, publishers, academics trying to report on what's happening, and a systematic program of mass murder of journalists, the assassination of more than 270 Palestinian journalists to prevent the reporting of these events. So we still have the old idea of kind of state repression, of censorship, of erasure of information, even as we have this kind of digital world where information escapes the nets and spreads out through society. And this then also gets contested formally, like at these presentations at the International Court of Justice, where evidence is being presented about these war crimes and whether they are motivated by an intent to commit genocide, or in fact whether they aren't. So looking at this, there's a fundamental set of conceptual issues that this is really about. So as I said, this is not about, is this a genocide? Should we pay attention to it? It's about, how do we understand the interpretations of it? Okay, so I want to identify 6 different issues that we need to look at. Firstly, we note that there are attempts to control awareness and meanings of violence, that this happens whether it's a criminal assault on the street, or whether it's a state genocide, or whether it's a mass killer. So we need to look at the attempt to control either by erasing information through this mass murder of journalists, or through structuring the interpretation of information by framing it in particular ways. Okay, secondly, and this is really getting to the more important stuff, that these narratives, these systems of meaning, create subject positions. And I'm using the word subject position as a kind of a technical post-structuralist term to talk about what we might think of as identities, or frameworks of meaning. They create ways of interpreting the world. So they don't just describe events happening or not happening. They make people look at the world around them and experience it in a certain way. And the way in which the experience of the world is structured by these meanings, not by people telling lies, not by the individual person telling a lie about what they see. They see one thing, but they say they're seeing another thing. But that what they're seeing is fundamentally structured through the system of interpretation. It's the critical role of the systems of interpretation that I want us to think about. Linked to that, the third point is that these may be more or less successful, that a particular perpetrator or particular state, aggressor, may be relatively more or less successful in achieving a kind of plausibility effect and getting people to believe their story and to create these social identities that achieve consensus, or they may completely fail to do that. Or they may relatively fail to do that, or people may move between different understanding and start understanding it some way and then shift towards understanding it another way. So this isn't just a simple open and shut case of like, oh, this is completely under control. The interpretation is under control by an authoritarian state or some such thing. Okay. Then looking at that, one of the things that's really important to think about is that what makes these systems of interpretation work is whether they fit with other things. And they need to fit with two other things. Firstly, they need to fit with pre-existing systems of meaning. They shouldn't radically change the system of meaning because people tend to resist that. So they should build on how people already think, how they interpret particular situations. But also, that there should be a kind of a desire to believe them, that we often think people believe stuff because they're presented with evidence, and that is simply not the case. People believe stuff because it feels nicer to believe this particular thing than another particular thing. There's a strong kind of emotional motivation to believe certain things. So if you can invest emotion in those interpretations, they become much more compelling, much more effective. Then, of course, as soon as we see all of that happening, we can see that in as much as it doesn't always work very well, that the opposite can be going on. There can be these counter-narratives that are doing kind of opposing work. That are saying, no, it's not so. It is, in fact, like this. So the counter-narratives present a kind of alternative, and then people can then move between these interpretative systems. And then one of the big problems is that the way in which those in power try to stop people shifting from one interpretative framework into another and try to kind of guide them into the one they want to stay in. And that all of this, of course, then leads to kind of antagonism. It leads to antagonisms of interpretation. It leads to kind of ordinary people, having fights with their family members or getting enraged with, something they see on social media. And so it creates fracturing, polarized positions and antagonisms at the level of kind of individual interpersonal experience. So we want to understand all of that going on within this sort of broader problem of how do we interpret the catastrophe in Gaza. Okay, so this brings us to our three different meanings of say no to genocide. And the first, as we said, say no to genocide, don't think about it, okay? Put your attention elsewhere. And this specifically in the new digital age, the age of social media, where certainly most young people's information about the world is communicated to them via digital media. And here what's really interesting is the dynamics at work with that, both the personal psychological dynamics and the technological dynamics. Because social media, the systems of social media, these are businesses. And they are interested in making money, and they're interested in making money by producing engagement. So they want to give you things that you respond to. And in this world, we suddenly saw this eruption of citizen journalism coming out of Gaza, of people suddenly seeing what was happening. And the newness of this is something we really need to understand, particularly for people in the West. And the newness is in contrast to the way in which the traditional media sources in the West never represented the violence of the colonization of Palestine, never represented the violence of the Israeli apartheid state and its crimes against humanity and abuses of human rights. That was all very strategically hidden in a highly organized way. So there was simply this idea of the only democracy in the Middle East, being attacked by terrorists. That was the traditional Western media. And even as the genocide unfolded, these bastions of so-called Western objective journalism, the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they all got exposed as having absolutely no interest in presenting an unbiased view, and in fact being actively involved with a very, very skewed construction of reality. And this is one of the interesting things to think about. But apart from that, the question of how people change their own social media feeds. This is what's different about social media and traditional media, is that every act you engage in, everything you like, everything you quickly scroll past, affects the rest of your social media feeds. It's a design system of interpreting all of your interactions on social media and then optimizing your engagement based on that. So if something seems interesting or shocking to you and you pay attention to it, you'll get more of that. Or if something seems aversive to you and you quickly scroll past it, you'll get less of it. So in this sense, people can make their own interpretative universes based on emotional reactions. So because the witnessing of the unimaginable brutality of these events is so unpleasant that the most common reaction is just to try and get rid of it, just try and get it out of your social media feed, focus on nice things, and the algorithms will then support you in doing that and enhance that process and make that unpleasant stimulus disappear out of your interpretative world. So this is a really important part of the idea of the interaction of the psychology of avoidance and the technology of structuring your own interpretative worlds through the interpretative work being done by the algorithms. But then going on to the second one, the no to genocide in the sense of genocide is not happening. We deny that there is a genocide. And there's also kind of an informational aspect there. Okay, so we've got the question of not allowing you access, making sure that if any Western journalist reports on this, that they get fired from their jobs, that the editors of those TV stations and news stations will not allow that information to be portrayed. So on a kind of organizational level, a system of massive control, but also the banning of journalists from coming into those areas, of just not allowing the international press to know what is going on. And then thirdly, and this in really an historically unprecedented way, the systematic mass murder of journalists, the assassination of more than 270 journalists in the space of 2 years. And not only assassinating people, but telling people, like sending people messages on their phone saying, if you carry on reporting, we will kill you, and then killing them. Or not only killing them, but killing their families. So this process of both censorship and the process with well loved of authoritarian regimes of kind of disappearing journalists, throwing them in jail, killing them, reaching this unprecedented historical scale where it was a primary methodological tool of the control of the narrative of the genocide. But that's not even the big one. The big one is the reframing of the interpretation. That's really the substance here. And this is where you really need to read the paper, because it would take me too long to explain all the details. But we've got three primary different groups involved here who want to reframe the understanding of genocide. Firstly, there's the kind of Western financial interest, you know, the billionaire class, the political elites, the people whose wealth depends historically for the last few hundred years of stealing natural resources from the global south. And certainly the idea of having a forward military base in the Middle East in order to control the oil supply, that is absolutely critical to this machinery of accumulation of capital. At the same time, that's not the only source of profit. The arms industry itself, conflict itself, is one of the most massively lucrative businesses. So we see billions of dollars in arms deals happening to support the sheer amount of military hardware, the sheer number of bombs required for this level of devastation. So there's real financial interests. And those financial interests need the genocide to be understood as something else, because they need it to be legitimate. So they need it to be a war, not a genocide. They need it to be self-defense, not a genocide. Okay. Then there's another sort of more kind of popular group, and a very big, this is by far the biggest group involved here, which is a religious group, and a diverse religious group of messianic fundamentalist Christians who have a theological notion of a kind of conflict in the Middle East leading to the arrival of the return of their Messiah. And this is an idea that was invented in the 18th century by kind of heretical Protestants who reinterpreted parts of the Bible to say, oh, Jesus will come again when the Jews return to Israel. And this went from being a kind of preposterous position based on literally one particular person's hallucinations, through the sort of become formally entrenched in the Schofield Bible to become a dominant position amongst Christian fundamentalist extremists. So for them, it's absolutely necessary to legitimate the state violence of Israel in order for that violence to continue in its kind of apocalyptic manifestation of the end times that really leads to the return of their Messiah and their salvation. Okay, and then the final group, and the group that is generally sort of left with the rap that these other groups get off the hook for, which is the Jewish colonial settlers who moved to Palestine after the Second World War, began the process of ethnic cleansing and set up the apartheid state of Israel. And what's different about this group is that the narrative of this group starts being based in reality in a way that the colonial narratives of the kind of Western arms and oil industries were always false. They were always based on the idea of, well, we are bringing, peace and civilization to the savage natives, or idea, these theological ideas of the divine ordination of these conflicts, and embedded in reality in the sense that European Jews in fact experienced the most horrific and relentless persecution, violence through centuries, leading up, of course, to the unimaginable spectacle of genocide, of the Holocaust, the historical incident for which the term genocide had to be invented, because we didn't even have a language for talking about that scale of intentional mass destruction, cruelty, violence, to extending to the idea of trying to bring about the end of the existence of an entire people. Um, but immediately that kind of basis in historical reality gets inverted, and then you get the alternate account of the state of Israel, the sort of version of, well, the only democracy in the Middle East is defending itself against terrorism. And this is, of course, again, like in the first example, this is the colonial re-inscription of facts, of saying, well, we just arrived in our ancestral homeland just to live in peace, and people started attacking us, and these crazy, savage natives started attacking us. This is always the language of colonialism. These terrorists started attacking us. They attacked us because they hate us, and they hate us because we are Jewish. And so rather than describing, and once again, you really need to read the paper to get all the detail of this, rather describing the way in which there was a brutal colonization, that before the State of Israel was formed, these terrorist groups had already been assembled by the Jewish European colonizers to engage in these mass acts of ethnic cleansing, attacking villages, murdering people, driving people out of their homes, raping people, stealing their homes, in order to get the indigenous population out of the land that they wanted to establish as their own state. And this is really important, because what we see in all of these counter stories is something really interesting. Is we see an inversion. We see like a story that is not just not the same as reality, it's almost like turning reality on its head. And specifically, it's a story of a perpetrator narrating themselves as a victim. And this is really interesting because this story is well known from a whole nother area of violence studies, which is intimate partner violence, domestic violence, family violence. And this has been described by a psychologist known as a friend, as DARVE, D-A-R-V-E, and this acronym standing for Deny, Attack, Reverse Victim and Offender. And we see this a lot in the logic of domestic violence, that the perpetrator of domestic violence isn't like, I beat her up because she wouldn't listen to me. They don't tell that story. They tell a story of, well, she was just provoking me and she made me so angry, and blaming the victim. So essentially, DARVO is the mechanism of victim blaming, broken down into its component parts. The mechanism of victim blaming, it's also what we would think about, and I'm working on this elsewhere at the moment, as the process of gaslighting, of trying to replace the interpretation of reality, the victim's interpretation of reality, with the perpetrator's interpretation of reality. And this is really interesting, and this loops back to my point, is it's not simply a matter of a liar versus a truth teller, a lying perpetrator versus a truth-telling victim. It's that people actually experience the same events differently, that often the perpetrators are not just lying, that they are genuinely experiencing the world in a way that is contrary to the facts of the matter. But there's a kind of authenticity in their distorted view. They're not deliberately, strategically telling an intentional falsehood. They're just utterly deluded. But looking at this aspect of deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender, so we see the kind of colonization of Palestine being denied, land without people for people without a land, that these refugees from Europe went back to their legitimate ancestral homeland, and they just settled there and started making the desert bloom. Lovely, colonial story. And then they were attacked. They were just attacked by these savages. And this is this is exactly the point where we see the reverse victim and offender. We see the colonized people trying to resist colonization, resist being ethnically cleansed, resist being driven off their farmlands, resist being driven out of their homes, resist being murdered and raped by the colonizers. And they are, instead of being understood as victims, they are then re-narrated as the offenders. And so you have the construction, and we see this happening increasingly later in the 1970s, 1980s, the construction of the notion of terrorism, that decolonial resistance to violent colonization, ethnic cleansing, dispossession, is in fact just terrorism. And it's that reversal, the denial of the violence of the colonizer, the attacking of the victim, that the victim did this, the victim, they teach their children to hate us, they just want to kill all of us. And the reversal of the victim and offender status in this. So we can take this notion of Darvo out of the psychological world of interpersonal violence and show that in fact it applies to political violence too, that this control of the narrative doesn't just involve presenting an alternative narrative or simply suppressing information. It involves this inversion and this construction of the perpetrators as victims. And often that is believed by the perpetrators. This is something we don't take seriously enough. Although certainly there's cynical political powers manipulating the system that have, the Netanyahus and people, they do not in any sense believe that. But ordinary Israelis, ordinary Western Jewish people actually get caught up in genuinely believing that inverted account and genuinely using that to understand the events in the world and genuinely feeling outraged when people say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Like that they're inhabiting a world where the experience of reality has been turned upside down by these ideological frameworks, by these systems of meaning that were strategically constructed to change their experience of reality. And this is the thing that I really want us to understand, to really understand the significance and the usefulness of moving away from a simple, like, these people are consciously lying, to people are interpreting things through a framework that precedes their own experience, that was created for them, and that that the world feels a certain way from that standpoint, regardless of whether that standpoint actually correlates with what's really going on outside of that interpretation. And here again, the question of social media becomes really important. The question that we talked about earlier, that we talked about people will simply don't look at that stuff. Look away. Look at the golden retriever little things and the unboxing TikToks or whatever you want to, anything else to fill that informational world without these horrors as a way of protecting yourself and sustaining your well-being. But of course, people also had the choice, and many, many millions of people did this, of saying, "Oh my God, this is horrific. I'm shocked," and following that shock and that outrage and sense of social injustice, and exploring that and deepening their understanding and reading up on the history of the region and how it relates to broader themes of Western colonialism. And that was another option, and an entire informational universe opened up that hadn't existed before, that typically in the West, that was excluded, that school curriculums were never allowed to cover that stuff, that the major newspapers and TV channels would not give, they were deliberately not allowed to give that perspective. But suddenly this thing was ruptured, and it became possible to explore these new, more critical forms of understanding. And in a sense, those who were trying to control the colonial narrative kind of left the door open and the horse got out. And it was too late. And they started in 2024 freaking out and saying we've lost the youth, meaning the youth of the West. That young people are getting their information directly from citizen journalists, not from these politically controlled legacy media institutions. And they were in a flat panic about it because their sense that if they lose the narrative, if people start engaging with the actual facts on the ground that are shown to them by people living that experience, and their political narrative collapses, their political project collapses, the legitimation project collapses. If the legitimation project collapses, their funding, their social acceptance, the supply of weapons from other countries, all of that collapses. And so the kind of colonial state is in jeopardy of not having enough legitimacy to carry on existing, because it doesn't just exist by brute force, it exists by narrating itself as justified in a certain way. And so, of course, then they're engaged in the kind of patch-up operation, which is happening as I'm sort of speaking, is the process of banning TikTok in the United States, forcing TikTok International to split off US TikTok as a subsidiary, to then sell that subsidiary to a consortium of Zionist investors, and especially Larry Ellison, the Oracle billionaire, the biggest donator to the IDF, to try and recontrol the narrative, realizing that you don't just need to control, the Australian, the BBC, the New York Times. You have to control the social media algorithm, which they were already controlling in Meta, in Facebook and Instagram, but they'd completely lost control of in TikTok. So now, certainly in the US, the kind of colonial project has regained control of TikTok as a space of meaning, as a space that generates understanding of events and allows people or prevents people from having access on information. But globally, that door is still open. And the big question that we're left with is it too late for them? Is the cat out of the bag? Do too many people know? Have too many people seen too much information to reassert the kind of colonial narrative of like, we're the good guys and these savages, these terrorists are just filled with hate and want to destroy us just because they are uncivilized or whatever, that 300, 400, 500-year-old colonial narrative. And this is unknown. This could go either way. But the important thing I wanted to leave you with, and it's elaborated much more in the paper, is to think about how meaning is constructed, and particularly how meaning of violence is constructed, and how it's not just a matter of access to information or not. That is highly relevant, as we saw by attempts to, get journalists fired, murder journalists. It's not just a matter of making the information available or not, it's a matter of framing the information. So this is really about the process of framing meaning, the process of making you experience a particular thing in a particular way, and that way then prevents you from seeing it in other ways that may give you more critical insights into who's in power, who is committing crimes against humanity, war crimes, and that process of contestation has to proceed via both more accurate information of what is taking place, but as importantly, understanding the systems of interpretation that structure how people experience their realities.